5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We are live.
Good afternoon. My name is Manuel Firmino Torres, and you are all welcome to the 17 Creativity Talk. This initiative was started by the Informatics Engineering Department of the Faculty of Engineering of University of Porto and organized in collaboration with the faculties of Fine Arts, Humanities, Psychology and Educational Sciences, as well as other institutions. We expect these talks to cover several scientific and artistic areas, discussing and studying creativity, and helping to promote a proactive attitude in our students and, more broadly, in our lives. Each talk will also feature a guest moderator who will, in turn, present our keynote speaker, which we are very honored to have today, Professor and researcher Jeffrey Krichmar. Our moderator, Armando Souza, has a PhD in electrical and computer engineering from Faculty of Engineering and University of Porto, and is currently an associate professor at this institution, as well as a senior researcher at the Center for Intelligent and Industrial Systems at the INESC Research Center. His research interest includes intelligent robotics, artificial intelligence, and higher education. He applies his knowledge to develop intelligent robots for industry, agriculture, and forestry. He is an Egypt certified international educator. Furthermore, he received several honors in both pedagogy and robotics. He has published over 80 peer-reviewed articles and holds a patent for a cord stopper identification device. He supervised more than 90 master's degrees and 6 PhDs. He contributes, finally, to projects such as HiRev, Intel Wheels 2, and Blockchain PT. So thank you very much, Armando. Please, the word is yours.
Before anything else, hello, everybody. Thank you, Professor Manuel Firmino Torres. It is our pleasure today to introduce Professor Jeff Krichmar. It's hard to have a decent presentation, but this kind of thing is to just read some kind of bio thing, and from there on, it's up to you. So Professor Jeffrey Krichmar is currently a professor at the University of Massachusetts. He spent some 15 years as a software engineering, ranging from the Patriot missile system at Raytheon Corporation and several other things, including IBM and being a senior fellow in theoretical neurobiology at the Neurosciences Institute. He was at since 2008. He has been a professor at the Department of Cognitive Sciences and Department of Computer Science in the University of California. He has over 20 years of experience in adaptive algorithms, neurobiologically plausible neural networks, and constructing brain-based robots whose behaviors are guided by neurobiology-inspired models. I'm gonna just keep the introduction short. I am more than happy to introduce Professor Jeff Krichmar, and I pass on the ground to you, and good luck. We'll keep on talking in a few seconds more, and thank you for being here once again. Please.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you for the invite and the nice introduction, Armando. It's actually going to be fun to present to such an interdisciplinary group. Let me make sure I can share screen and everything, and we can get going. And there we go. Hopefully you can see my screen now.
Yes, yes.
Okay,
Perfect.
great. So I'm going to talk today about my field of research, which is called neurorobotics, and it attempts to connect the brain, body, and environment through the use of robots. As Armando said, I'm from the University of California, Irvine. In the United States, we have mascots for our sports teams. So the mascot for Irvine is the anteater. It's a long story. We can maybe save that for Q&A if you're really interested. But that led, as soon as I established the lab, to the acronym Cognitive Anteater Robotics Laboratory, or CARL. So we name all our robots CARL. And the neurorobotics field, and I'm just a member of the field, it's a subfield of the cognitive robotics field, but it's more grounded in the nervous system. So the controller is modeled after some aspect of the nervous system. And that allows us to test theories so we can increase our understanding of how the brain works. And it also, because I think there's still, despite all the progress in AI and machine learning over the last few years, I think there's still some areas where it falls short. And so we can use biological intelligence as a model to build better autonomous systems and using this approach. I've been for a while in teaching it at our university. I taught and still teach for many years, but my former student, Tiffany Hu, and I taught a course called Cognitive Robotics for many years and realized that we really didn't have a textbook that followed what we were doing. So we wrote this book, Neurorobotics, which is part textbook, part kind of a opinion or position piece about what neurorobotics is. And I'm going to follow some of the main themes, which are the design principles that we've, over the years through doing this, teaching this, and also developing these models, realized that to build one of these systems that you have to follow these, at least as many as these principles as possible. And there's three levels. There's the response, kind of reactive response, which really brings in embodiment. There's the learning and memory over the lifetime of the robot or the organism. And then interestingly, there's trade-offs between things that you have to make decisions over. And I'll explain all of these in just a little more detail. And then I'll go on to give a couple recent examples from our lab that follow these principles. So that's the plan for today. So let's start with the first level, which is responding to the here and now. And even though I'm a computational neuroscientist, over the years, reading and trying to make these robots work and looking at how biology does the amazing things it does, that embodiment is really important, and that I kind of believe the body shapes the mind. There's a lot of things our body are doing, and our mind is kind of responding, planning, responding to that, maybe planning. There's this notion of morphological computation that was from Rolf Pfeiffer and Josh Bongard. They defined this as that the body can relieve the brain of many processes by doing certain things. And it's in an idea called cheap design, that you can actually leverage the body and the physics of the environment. A good example is walking. So most of the humanoid robots are highly controlled. They take a lot of energy compared to us when we walk. And here's a group of people walking. This is a group at Cornell, and they develop these robots that actually have a lot of passive dynamics. So this robot, even though it's kind of a tripod robot, it pushes off with its feet and then falls down. So it's using gravity and friction to its advantage. And what's amazing about this robot is it's powered by a very small battery and takes extremely low power. And if you get to the very end, see if I can get further along. The robot goes around for hours on one battery charge till it finally drops. People have long gone in this this walkathon, and I forget how many kilometers it goes. It'll say right now. Yeah, 65 kilometers on a small battery charge. So it really drove home when I visited this lab, and they were mechanical engineers, but they said their goal was to minimize energy. As soon as they minimize energy, they said as much as they could, they said the robot and system looked very natural and biological. So I think there's a big lesson there. And you see this throughout the animal kingdom. This video is work by a group in Purdue, and they take inspiration from the chameleon of all things, and a lot of soft, biology uses a lot of soft compliant materials, and a lot of energy can be stored in the elasticity of those materials. And the chameleon tongue and also the legs and muscles of not just this woodpecker, but all organisms that have muscles actually do a lot of computation that alleviates the brain from having to do a lot of control. So you see this throughout neurobiology or biology. But what about neurobiology? I'm also part of a field called neuromorphic engineering. And in that field, hardware engineers are trying to develop and design low power efficient, highly parallel computers. And they realized they should take inspiration from the brain. A major reason is because the brain is highly parallel. You've got all these processors, which are neurons. And what's interesting about the neuron is they spike they spike action potentials. And most of the energy is when generating the potential and then actually dealing with the synapse at the receiving neuron end. But between spikes, it's not using very much power or energy. And neurons don't fire very often. They fire when a neuron is firing at a very high rate. It's 100 times a second. So that's nothing compared to computers, which are running at gigabits per second. So some of these groups that have made this coming from the labs, there's Spinnaker from Manchester University. There is IBM's True North, and then Intel Loihi and a bunch of other groups. There's also sensors that follow this, vision and auditory sensors that follow this. We went to a workshop in Telluride, Colorado, and worked with some of the IBM engineers and developed a spiking neural network to follow a mountain trail. And it doesn't really show in this video well, but this is a very difficult hilly trail, very rough, and there's a huge drop off down this mountain. So that's why, because this was the first time the IBM's chip was put on a robot or a closed loop system, and so they were very concerned about losing millions of dollars in R&D. So there's a rope just in case it goes off trail, but luckily it stayed on the trail. And this isn't in AI sense a difficult problem, but what was interesting and really a selling point to me was the robot is run by a nickel metal hydride battery for a remote control car. And once we've hooked up this chip, which had the full neural network running, it used the same battery, and we ran this for hours up and down these trails, and it never lost its charge, which really drove home like these neuromorphic computing chips, which are kind of using the some ideas from cheap design and more cheap design in the embodied sense, there actually could be very useful going down the road for any edge device and not just robotics. Okay, another kind of here and now design principle that we've realized over the years is, I'm in the cognitive science department at Irvine, and we've all been trained to teach cognitive science like sense, then think, then act, and a lot of artificial intelligence followed this loop. But really, the natural way of doing cognitive science or just biology in general is we're multitaskers. We respond to events. So we're doing multiple things at once, and we're event driven. And that's a different way of designing your system. And some nice work from the University of Sheffield by Tony Prescott's group showed this. They modeled the basal ganglia, and I'll explain in a minute, but let me just show you the video of their system. So this is a standard test for neurobiology called the open field test. And you put a rat or a mouse in an environment and it'll stick to the walls like this robot till it feels like this is a safe area. And then it'll go and investigate things and maybe forage for food. And that's what this robot's doing. And this robot is driven by two motivations. One is fear and the other is hunger. And so when the hunger outweighs the fear, then it will start to move into the middle of the room. And then there's different events that happen. Like one is hitting the wall, another is seeing a cylinder, and another is being able to pick up the cylinder, and another is finding a wall to drop off the cylinder. And an area that's really good at this multitasking, event-driven processing is the basal ganglia. And I won't go into detail about the model, but the basal ganglia works mainly through inhibition, in that most of the action systems, subsystems, they're running monitoring in parallel, and certain events will trigger an action selection system to release that. So it releases from inhibition. So it's everything is, when it's working properly, is inhibited except the action that you're supposed to take. And it's a really nice design, efficient design for event-driven processing that the brain has figured out. Okay, that was a very brief tour through the first set of design principles. There's others, but in the interest of time and getting to some of our newer stuff, I want to jump to the next set, which is learning and memory. And first, for learning and memory, you need some sort of motivation system. And we've called that over the years the value systems. So these are signals of good and bad, reward and punishment, but it's more than that. They're more subtle things besides just reward and punishment. There are things like the cost of a movement. There's the things like how much your attentional system will deal with surprises or deal with the noisy background, or just how curious you are. And what's interesting, and this is a theme that'll come up again, is a lot of the value systems are driven and monitored by subcortical systems, subcortical neuromodulatory systems. For example, serotonin does a lot of things, but seems to be important for the cost of an action. Dopamine is thought to kind of monitor a reward prediction error. Norepinephrine is important for how well you deal with surprises. And acetylcholine is kind of pushing how much attentional effort you'll put into something. And if you see this color coding, they're all in the midbrain or around the hypothalamus. They all have small pools of neurons, and they are the sources of these chemicals that go broadly to the rest of the brain. And interesting, they follow a certain parallel that if you're trying to figure out things and you want to be on task, there's a tonic level of neuromodulation, and the organism is exploratory, almost curious. If some important event signal comes into it, then there's a phasic response, a very quick phasic response. And this causes the organism to actually be decisive. So it's a nice exploitative exploration trade-off that these chemicals actually monitor and trigger. And so one of our first Carls was setting up this system and looking at the dopamine system, so this ventral tegmental area, and the raphe system, which is the serotonin area. And each pixel in this display is a neuron in the brain. Right now, all the pixels are kind of 25% active, so all these neurons are about, tonically active. And the nervous system in this robot has visual system for green, cyan, magenta, red, and a couple other colors that I didn't show. So let me run the video and show you what this does. So the robot's been trained that one color is predictive of good and another is predictive of something to stay away. So there's the serotonin system. It very rapidly realizes that should stay away. It stays a distance. Now it turns green. There's a nice phasic response, and it approaches the rewarding green panel. And interestingly, you notice that when these phasic responses happen, that the salient color gets lit up and increases very high, and all the other colors drop out to 0. So the signal to noise ratio really goes way up. If it's something non-salient, like right now, like the magenta or the cyan, then it's in this tonic neuromodulation, and its actions will be kind of more exploratory. So this neuromodulation not only drives learning and motivation, but it also drives an attention system by the way that phasic neuromodulation works. Now, in general, learning and memory is very different in biological systems and natural systems than artificial systems. We can learn things very quickly. We learn incrementally, so we're always learning. And we can learn something in just a few presentations, and then we can actually generalize that and apply it to other things. So we can do transfer learning. And when we learn something new, we don't forget what we learned before. So these are all things that artificial systems are really struggling with. And so I think there's some, and actually some of the AI people have approached myself and other neuroscientists to actually address some of these problems with some of the things that the brain does. And one thing about how the long-term memory works, especially episodic and declarative memory, is it consolidates things. And the old idea was that the medial temporal lobe, which has the hippocampus, would take events that happen in your life or just some episode, and they would put these things together. For example, like this duck and this bakery. So this is not congruent. It's not been seen before. And so the hippocampus and the medial temporal lobe will learn this conjunction of information, this episode of information. And then over time, it'll consolidate this into the cortex. So this is the standard model of consolidation. And it was thought that you need the hippocampus and you need time period before information goes from the hippocampus and medial temporal lobe into the neocortex, where it can stay for, in the human's case, lifetimes. But some clever experiments, first in the rat and then following up in the human, showed that, hey, if something fits within a context, so let's say I already have the knowledge that in a bathtub that there's this rubber duck toy, and that a real duck, I see a real duck and I go, well, a real duck is related to a bathtub duck and also is in the water. So that's congruent. So in that case, it fits within a context, or what we call a schema. And that means that this information, this new information, can get consolidated very rapidly into the cortex. And there's probably there seems to be active kind of inhibition of the medial temporal lobe in that case, because you only need it maybe initially to get this conjunction, but then right after that, very quickly, it gets into the cortex. And this kind of changed the dogma of how long-term memory is consolidated. And came up with this model by Van Kesteren, a theoretical model, the schema-linked interactions between medial prefrontal and medial temporal regions, or they called it SLIM. So Tiffany Hu and Hirak Kashyap in my lab were very interested in this model and how it might apply to robotics. So they developed a neural network model that had the hippocampus, the different areas, that had a medial prefrontal cortex that that learned schemas for different contexts and would intervene if something was congruent. So if something was unfamiliar and novel, it would create a new schema. But if something was novel in a familiar context, then it would update an existing schema. And they replicated the work with rats first, and then put it on one of our robots, the Carl support robot, or Carl Senior. And so here's the robot and system in action. So you can type in an object to look for, like teddy bear. This is the first time the robot's been in this area, and it's a classroom with items that you'd find in a classroom. So it's looking for the teddy bear, but it's also building up a schema of this classroom environment. And the first time it's picked up a teddy bear, so it takes a while. But now, a few trials later, it knows exactly where the teddy bear is, and then picks it up immediately. Now we put it in a new context. This is a break room where we usually, have food and prepare food. And so it's going to pick up a cup, but it's the first time in this room, so it's building up a brand new schema for this break room, and it finds the cup eventually. And now if we ask it to pick up the cup again, it goes right there. What if we ask it to pick up something it hasn't picked up before in the original schema? So it immediately knows where it is. It hasn't forgotten this original schema. It does fine. Or what if we trigger it with something it's never picked up before? Where would it think it should be? And so the place cells in its neural network say, well, that should be likely on a table in the break room. And then it goes immediately to the table looking for this banana that's food. So in this nice way, it solved a problem that's a big problem for artificial neural nets, which is catastrophic forgetting. And so maybe this schema system in the brain is the brain's way of getting over catastrophic forgetting by putting things in context and developing new context for things that are incongruent. And it really fits with the learning and memory. There's for especially episodic and declarative memory. If you want more details, you can look at the papers. It's using something called contrastive Hebbian learning, which is a biologically plausible semi-supervised learning to actually do some of the connections. So we've talked about motivation. We've talked about learning and memory systems and different parts of the brain that are important for it. Another important thing is in the learning and memory over a lifetime is prediction. And that previous video showed some prediction, but in general, you need to build internal models, and the brain is very good at that. So what this does is it reduces surprises. Surprises take energy. If something doesn't fit, so unexpected, you may throw out your priors and adapt to changes. Someone that's done a lot of work in this with recurrent neural networks is Jun Tani's group in Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology. So he's done a lot of work with robots pointing and reaching tasks. And so this robot learned to predict the movements of this bouncing ball. And then when it changed, it had to throw out its priors and build a new internal model. And it had a hierarchy of recurrent neural nets, and some were operating at a slow time scale that actually could build up the internal model, and some were acting at a fast time scale that were dealing with the very small movements in the arm. And it doesn't have to have that switch from red to blue. It can do very well just because the movement violates the prediction, like right there. And so after a little bit of searching, it very quickly was able to respond to their surprise and build a new internal model and then move nice and do a nice prediction. So these three things are, I think, hallmarks of the learning and memory. Now, the last set of trade-offs is what I call behavioral trade-offs. And we've talked about reward versus punishment. We've talked a little bit about exploration versus exploitation. You see this throughout nature, where an organism might forage for something, and that puts it out at risk, and it puts its home base or or nest at risk. And so then it might actually want to stay and defend that. But then if it's defending, not getting food. So there's a trade-off there. There's even kind of social trade-offs. Am I going to be active or am I going to be withdrawn? Am I going to interact with others, social, or am I going to be solitary? And even like our stress, dealing with stress is important, but then you want to be calm. Dealing with stress takes energy. It's important for survival, but there's this trade-off. You don't want to always be stressed out. When we looked into this, I found it fascinating that a lot of the trade-offs were monitored and also signaled. Which side of the trade-off was signaled by chemicals in the brain, low-level subcortical chemicals. So we've talked about some of these, dopamine and serotonin, important for reward, dopamine, and maybe punishment, serotonin. Invigoration, dopamine, withdrawn, serotonin. In the attention system, there's a trade-off on how you deal with uncertainties between acetylcholine and noradrenaline. And then some of the neurohormones also are important. For feeding, there's orexin. For dealing with stress, there's the stress hormones, glucocorticoids. And for interacting with others, oxytocin is actually a hormone that gets involved in these things. So I find it very interesting that these very basic things that we do that we change our moods and our decision making actually are somewhat controlled by low-level processes in the hypothalamus and the midbrain and the brainstem. I should say we're not slaves to that. A lot of the cortical areas, especially the prefrontal cortex, have projections down to these to kind of set levels of these. So we do have some voluntary control over these. So we were interested in these trade-offs. So we made a robot based on an old Roomba that actually explored some of these trade-offs without long-term learning, but with more reactive kind of learning, like the sensitization and habituation. And here's the setup. It's that open field. It's that open field test. And so our robot will, when it's in a new environment, stay close to the wall because it's not sure if this is a safe environment. And in the upper right corner of the video, there's the Roomba's charging station. So that's its home or its nest. Now, after time, if the robot feels like this is a safe area, it'll get curious and it'll explore something in the middle of the room. And this is typical behavior of a mouse or a rat in this open field test. And the network of this had tonic and phasic neuromodulation of the serotonin and dopamine system, as well as an attentional system to allow new information to get through. Now, when we ran the experiments, we ran this completely in the dark. So we'd run it in the dark, and then once the robot seemed like it was comfortable, which was about 60 seconds into the experiment, no, maybe 2 minutes into the experiment, we would flash on the lights very quickly. And that light flash would cause a response, a fear response in the robot. And so here's typical behavior. The lights flash at time 0, and then the robot is anxious, so that means it goes to the wall or its charging station and stays there till about 60 seconds out, and then the serotonin system, the tonic, the level of serotonin kind of drops down, and the level of dopamine starts to come up, and then it starts to do curious behavior, which would be going into the middle room or investigating this red object in the middle of the room. What's nice about this model is we can play with the levels of these chemicals in this artificial brain. So we can play with in a sense, the reuptake by changing the time constants, the reuptake of this artificial serotonin. So if we set the serotonin levels high after that stress event with the lights flashing, then the robot never gets out of this anxious state. it just stays constantly anxious. It's like, and becomes withdrawn. So it's almost like we've made the robot highly, with an anxiety disorder or depressed in a sense. And then we can do the same with dopamine. We can set the reuptake so there's too much dopamine in the system. And so even though there was a stressor, the dopamine never goes down. And so now it's like a robot on cocaine, and the robot is constantly moving around and going to the middle of the room. This follows, and this could be an example of obsessive compulsive behavior in a robot. And not to be kind of facetious and funny, but this follows some models, mouse models for these disorders. So in this way, you can use these kind of models to actually say, hey, what would happen under certain situations if these levels were changed? And what's nice about these systems in general is you can look at multiple systems, multiple neuromodulators in multiple brain areas at the same time, which gives you a lot more power. It's very difficult to do some of these things experimentally. Okay, so those are the three sets of design principles going very rapidly, and that's kind of giving you a little history and a little background for it. And in the remaining time, I want to go through a couple relatively new studies from our lab that actually follow these principles. So case studies from the Carl lab. The first one has to do with path planning. So if you have a representation of space, a map, you still need a way to use that to find your way to goals. And you can do it in two levels. One is how you react immediately. So if you're trying to get to a goal and something gets in your way, you have to get around that obstacle and continue to your goal. But another way that involves more learning and memory and planning is figuring out what is the most effective route. Maybe not the most optimal. It might have to do with context. So what is the most efficient way to traverse a large area given a context? And there's some evidence in the brain that animals do this and actually plan paths. And one has to do with the hippocampus. So hippocampus, as we talked before, is very important for learning and memory, but it's very important for spatial navigation. And many years of work in the rat have shown this, and now in the human as well. But recordings from the rat hippocampus, you see something that's called a place cell. So as the rat's moving down this track, you can actually record from, if you record from enough neurons, you can find a neuron that responds to each location as it moves along. So that's these color codes going from red all the way to blue. And these are sufficient to actually localize where the animal is. And this kind of wavy sinusoidal signal is representing a theta wave. So there's all these rhythms that these place cells are responding on top of at certain phases. So that's been known for a long time, 50 years now. What happened more recently, especially when recording from these brain areas during sleep, you would see sometimes a replay with this compressed, what they call a sharp wave ripple, a replay of the sequence backwards. And that might be important for credit assignment. So you see the sequence, if you look at the color coding, from blue back to red. Or sometimes you would see the sequence going forward, which they called a pre-play. And then later on, they found that it wasn't just during sleep, and that was sleep might have been, they were considering sleep was very important for consolidating memories that happened during the day. But it also happened when the animal was kind of quiet waking. So it was just sitting there kind of chilling out. And then you'd see, all these signals of a path that it might take. It might not even be the exact path it took before. It might be a novel path. And so when we saw this, us and others, we said, hey, that might be a way that the rat is doing some sort of path planning and prediction. And then another piece of evidence that I found intriguing that's relatively recent was the white matter is plastic. So the axons in the brain are plastic. So I don't know how much neuroscience people have, but the neurons are connected with axons. And if the axon is fairly long, you don't want the signal to attenuate. So there's this natural conductive coating around the axon fiber, which is called a myelin sheath. And under a microscope, it looks kind of whitish. So they call it white matter. And the neurons and the neuron itself is kind of grayish. So they call it gray matter. So this white matter actually allows the signal to move faster and not attenuate as much. And then every so often there are these nodes called the nodes of Ranvier. And there's some support proteins that called glial cells that support this. And what they do is they boost the signal. So they allow the signal, if it gets here, to kind of boost again. So again, it doesn't attenuate. Well, what people found now roughly only 10 years ago, that with experience, the sheath gets thicker and there's more nodes of Ranvier, which means that the signal is more reliable and can move faster. The velocity of it is faster. And this is, shown in rats by a reaching task by rats, but it was also shown comparing, because you can do this, you can image the white matter in the brain non-invasively. So they've also shown it with humans and looking at, for example, skilled musicians versus non-musicians and seeing there's an increase in white matter. So I thought this was intriguing. There's not much modeling out there looking at white matter plasticity. So we wanted to add that to this idea. And so here's the idea that Tiffany Hu and I came up with back in 2018 called a spiking wavefront propagation path planner. So it works a little like this. Let's say you're at this node here and you want to go this node down here called goal. And each one of these circles or nodes is a spiking neuron. And each line between the neurons is an axon. And the axons have a variable delay. So if it's in the green area, the delay can go, let's say, with a time delay of 1. But if it's in this gray area, say it's a muddy, hilly area, the delay is 2. So if I seed a spike at the start neuron, and it propagates like a wave to its neighboring neurons, but notice it's propagating to neighboring neurons, but there's a delay in propagating to neurons in this gray area. And I just proceed with the wave until it reaches the goal neuron. And then I can back out recursively what caused each neuron to fire. And lo and behold, I can get an efficient optimal path by doing this. And that's just doing it with a preset map. Now, later on, Harris and Espino in our lab and myself and others ran across this spiking version of backpropagation through time that came out of Wolfgang Moss's group with his fellow Bellick, and they called it eProp. So it has a recurrent neural net with an eligibility trace, and this seemed to be perfect for what we wanted to do. So let's say our robot went from the upper left to the lower right, and these are the neurons that fired and when. So the brighter, redder colors is a more recent firing. So these would be, the coloring is how eligible the neurons are. And then we assume that the robot at each of its, at each of these nodes, as it's progressing, each node is a place in the environment. It's a place cell, in that it can also sense its surroundings. So it can also not only just look at this neuron, but neighboring neurons. And so then you can, with this eProp, you can develop a learning rule that is how much my predicted expected value of what I'm sensing differs from the actual value of what my sensors read. So that's my loss function. And then the credit assignment is how eligible is my neuron, and that's this E. And the eligibility trace drops off with a time constant. And this is sufficient to do the credit assignment and this back propagation through time. And so we thought this was a great learning rule for what we want to do. And instead of applying it to the synapse, we apply it to the delays. So the delays now learn based on the environmental sensing. And then we can use this wavefront propagation. Okay, and there's all the math. I won't go through it unless you're interested. This came out about a year ago in IEEE Robotics and Automation Letters, and also was presented at ICRA. So if you're interested. Okay, but let me show you what Harrison did. He took one of our robots. In the middle of our university is this really nice park, which is highly variable in trees and pathways and terrain. And he thought, well, there's a lot of different traversal costs for this environment. One is how much energy the robot needs. So he measured the current drawn from the battery to the wheels. And then, as you can see, there's trees, benches, people, so obstacles. How much time was it spent avoiding obstacles? And we had a LiDAR on the robot. And then you'll see in some of the videos that it's hilly. So how much pitch and roll from the IMU on the robot? So all of these costs went into building a map of this environment that was based on these costs, and the costs were realized in the delays between neurons. And just to give you an idea, this is a path on the upper left and right. The left is before learning, and the original path, which would be like the shortest way between 2 points, takes you through a lot of obstacles. So on the right, it's taking a more convoluted path, but it's avoiding a lot of those trees and benches. And so this happened with just its own exploration of the environment and building up these maps, these cost maps, which were realized in the delays between the neurons in this model. Another example, which really nicely shows this, is the point between the start and goal here goes along a very steep hill. And so the robot is really bent over or tipped on its side to the point where it might actually flip over if we weren't careful. So after learning that and realizing that was a big slope, the robot adapted and took a lower cost path, which went up the hill along a flat ridge and then rolling down. And so all this happened through this continuous learning and adapting and taking costs into consideration. What's also nice about this algorithm is it's continuously learning, but it can rapidly adapt. So Harrison put a bunch of buckets in the middle of one of its paths, and it had to go around the bucket. And that actually triggered an obstacle cost. So in the very next trial, the robot updates its cost map, takes a new path around those obstacles, generalizes to take advantage of this ridge, and goes along the flat part of the ridge and then back down to the goal. So this is after one update. So this is like one-shot learning, which is really nice for this. So this was doing continuous learning and single-shot or few-shot learning. And it nicely follows some of the principles I said at the outset. It's embodied. The robot is using multiple sensors to experience its environment. It's efficient in learning low-cost pathways, and it's using the behavioral trade-offs. It's actually using behavioral trade-offs between these different costs when planning paths. And it nicely solves a problem that's open in robotics, so that it's continuous, simultaneously mapping the real world and planning paths. So it's an active version of SLAM in a sense. It's continuous learning, it was only a few hours that it learned the map. You know, some of the competitors to this would be, you know, deep reinforcement learning models. They take, you know, weeks to months to actually train up. This operates in real time. It's quite lightweight. And it's in the spiking domain, so it can be implemented on neuromorphic hardware. It has been in the past, and so that means you could reduce the size, weight, and power of the system. So I think there's a lot of potential with this approach. Okay, one last case study, and then we can have a discussion. Another area of research in our lab besides navigation is what is intelligence? And we've been exploring an organism that isn't typically looked at for intelligence, is the cuttlefish or cephalopods. And I've almost become obsessed with these things. So when we think of what's, you know, highly intelligent, extremely cognitive, we think of ourselves, and we're members of the great apes. And then relatively recent work has shown that other animals, and especially corvids, which include crows and jays, show a lot of intelligent behavior. They're able to show episodic memory. They're able to do tricks like deceive and plan ahead. And so they also have been thought of as highly intelligent. And these are both vertebrates. But then more recently, people have been looking at cephalopods, which include octopus, cuttlefish, and squid. And these organisms also show extreme intelligence, but they're very different. They have a completely different brain because they're invertebrates, different architecture, different brain areas. They show a very rapid learning and memory. They show ability to signal through their skin, which a lot of people look at for camouflage, but just if you're looking at them, they actually are doing this signaling with their skin to actually communicate information, and they solve all sorts of problems. But different from the class of intelligent animals like corvids and primates, these are not social animals. They're typically solitary, and they live very short lives. They typically, after they mate 1 or 2 years into life, then they pass away. So why would an animal that's solitary and short-lived be so intelligent? Which is a really open question of what is intelligence. And part of it might be the ecological pressure. So we're really intrigued with this system, and it's just beautiful to look at. And we're doing this in many ways, but the first cut by this really wonderful group of undergrads, and you guys are an interdisciplinary group. We brought in people from all across the campus. We have, you know, cognitive scientists, computer scientists, engineers, and we also thought there should be some aesthetics, so we brought in artists to all work on this project, and they're still working on it. Our first pass at it was to take an off-the-shelf robot, have a shell that we made ourselves, embed the shell with LEDs so we could actually do camouflaging and signaling, and then have an ability to grab something and interact, and obviously be mobile. And so here's the full system. And you see the robot is in this room. There are objects there. And if the object is this blue cup, it can pick that up. And so that is something that it can eat. If it's this green volleyball, then it can't pick that up. So it realizes that's something that's a predator. And as it moves around, it can, like it's doing now, camouflage. So here's its basic behaviors. Here's it eating prey. So it gives a signal, like this traveling wave signal, that's known to kind of stun or hypnotize the prey. So it's motionless for a moment, confused, and then it'll attack the prey and grab it. Now, if it sees a predator, it'll back away from the predator and then change the color of its shell to match the flooring so that it actually is camouflaged. Another thing that cuttlefish do, besides camouflaging when they see a predator, sometimes they'll play dead. So they'll turn their shell kind of a pale white, like right there. And that might confuse the predator by thinking, oh, this animal's dead, I don't want to bother eating it. So those are the basic behaviors that we came up with. And then we used a reinforcement learning paradigm and showed that over time, as you got to like the end of a session, which sessions lasted 5 minutes, it would, when it saw prey, it would approach it and eat it, and it would not camouflage when it saw prey. Whereas when it saw a predator, by the end, it was deciding kind of 50-50 almost to either blanch or camouflage in the presence of a predator. And so I think this also follows the design principles. You've got this embodiment, which is the dynamic shell and this ability to move around and grab things. It's got learning and memory. It's a basic, reinforcement learning model, but it does learn preferences, which is important so we can see the behavior and that it's doing the appropriate actions. It's got certain trade-offs between hunting prey and avoiding predators, and using certain signaling. For the hunting prey, it uses that traveling wave hypnotizing kind of signal, and for predator, it might camouflage or blanch. And this is like early, it's only the first step. We're actually working on a new biomimetic robot and also working on a memory system that's more sophisticated. It turns out these cephalopods have something like episodic memory. They can remember the what, when, and where events, but they don't have a hippocampus, which I find really interesting too. So we're really going to investigate the neuroanatomy and work with some people who are imaging this organism, and to actually mimic the arms of cuttlefish and maybe octopus. We're looking at soft robotic components because the arms are incredibly flexible and don't have bones. So it's also interesting in itself. All right, so let me wrap up. So I've kind of rapidly took you through the book. Now you don't need to buy it or read it, but please do. And the meat of the book is these design principles. So I've walked through very quickly the design principles. And I think one of our goals, and hopefully the goal of what I've shown you, is trying to get to a better understanding of what is intelligence. And then on the flip side, how can we use that to improve autonomous systems? And this is the group. Let's see, there's Harrison. I talked a lot about his work. There's Tiffany. I talked a lot about her work. Michael and Catherine and Alina and Ellie and Shri, probably forgetting a few people, all worked on the Cuttlebot robot. And this is, over the years, many great people have come through in the lab and then gone on to do great things. Oh, there's Harat Kashyap, who also worked on the schema model of memory. And I will stop there and take any questions you have. Thank you for your attention. Why don't I stop sharing? I can reshare if we have to.
Estás muted, man.
So thank you. So we can take a few questions from the audience. Maybe you can start, Professor Manuel Firmino.
Yes, thank you for your amazing and very inspiring talk, first of all. And I would like to make a question because about memory. We know that by a recent article of 2 years ago, human memory exhibits a phenomenon called spreading activation, where activating one memory pathway also partially activates related pathways. Although this has a negative effect on memory, making it unreliable, usually, it can have a very positive effect on problem solving. Prime pathways can lead to unexpected connections, fostering creative insights. Taking breaks like walking, for instance, can help by allowing different pathways to interact, resulting in ha moments. Can we envision robots walking in a park to drive creativity in the future?
I would love to. I mean, I think the models that we've done in a simple way are doing that because they are finding novel pathways that haven't been used before. So that's kind of an aha moment. Now, can we scale it to more creative ideas? I think there's nothing stopping it from. I think some of the machinery we've gone through, some still needs to be explored. One of the things with the way declarative episodic memory works and is that it activates parts of all over the brain because the medial temporal lobe is getting this convergence of all sorts of information. And I've just in my modeling just used a very small subset of all the different types of information pathways. So if you had enough pathways coming into a system like that actually, and I think it's interesting, especially some of the work with the consolidation and replay. And I've seen this with people using this with deep reinforcement learning to get aha moments for some of the tasks they're doing. That replaying things in somewhat random fashion, but semi-random fashion, can lead to new pathways and new results. And as you say, it's interesting because they find this in humans, which can be a little tricky for social reasons, that memories are labile, they change. So every time you recall a memory, you slightly change it. And so that our memories are not, as we've seen time and time again, are not perfect photographic memory, except for a few very special individuals. So I find that interesting too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we have a listener that is actually asking if concerning the robot that was roaming in the park, if the robot somehow creates checkpoints and after it just follows the checkpoints, or if the robot computes an optimal path.
Oh, so the way it was tested in this particular example was it would be in a certain point, a certain location, and we just randomly give it another location to go to. And we followed a Levy flight model, which is typical of animals foraging, where you'll spend a lot of time locally and then you'll bounce somewhere far away. And so that was a good way to explore a large space. And then we did that over 12 hours. And so once it planned a path, the path was a whole set of checkpoints to go through the different nodes of the network, which were different locations. So it was almost like, the Pac-Man game where it would set up a whole bunch of things I would have to follow along. And if something happened in the middle, that would change and it'd have to reroute. Like if there was an obstacle that it never experienced, then it would stop and then run the system again and reroute. That's why you saw the rapid adaptation. One thing we didn't do that people always ask is we knew the environment before. I mean, we knew the boundaries of the environment. What we'd like to do or like to see, and we think we could support it, but it would need some changes, is what if you start from scratch, you don't know the boundaries, and you go, or you have a boundary, but then you go beyond, can you, stitch together larger and larger maps? And that's an open problem that Harrison is actually working on right now. But that's important too, because you don't always know where, the front, you basically need to be able to build the frontiers of your map as you go along.
Okay, thank you. But I was just curious, and this one is from my own. How do you deal with dynamics?
The dynamics of which? The robot?
No, the dynamics of the environment. So if something changes,
Yeah, good question, because we were wondering about that. This area, because we ran at different times of day, and this is an area that is highly populated with students. And depending on the time of day, if class has just gotten out or something, there can be lots of students, and it's dynamic. What was interesting is it was able to filter that out by enough experience. It actually filtered out the people that were moving because those obstacles came and went, and so it had a minimal effect. I always wondered though, and we didn't get to it, if another factor as it was sensing was the time of day, because I do this when I go to class. When I teach, I know if it's 5 minutes before my class is going to start, it's going to be one pathway is going to be mobbed with students. So I go way out of my way through that park. So that was one of the inspirations for this, but we haven't gotten to that yet. But I think that would actually be interesting too, if it took time of day, and then it probably would be another cost effect. But we were pleased that it actually filtered out the dynamic things based on its experience.
Coming to think of it, it kind of involves some kind of hierarchy, right? So there might be some even higher level of thinking when going through the maps. It's very interesting.
We have another project that's looking at that and done some modeling of that. Now we're following up with some colleagues that are doing experiments in the rodent and the human. But there's kind of different perspectives. When you're thinking about it, well, for humans, we literally use a map and we look around, and we're going between local views and more global views. But we really believe that without the mapping, like animals probably are doing this somehow in their brain. So there's not much experimental evidence. So I'm working with some really, really good people that are going to try and get experimental evidence for both humans and rodents.
Yeah, great. Okay, so there is another question here. Does Neurorobotics use robots to test hypotheses about human behavior and the brain, or does it mainly apply findings from cognitive science to actually build better robots?
It does both. That's the goal. That's the goal of the field. Cognitive robotics, that's the goal of cognitive robotics, but it's broader. Neurorobotics really tries to focus on the system. So looking at the neurons, the synapses, the different brain areas. Most of the work depends. It used to be most of the work depended on where you could get data at that systems level. So it was the model organisms like mice, rats, some primates, and even some invertebrate insects. Nowadays, we got a lot more human data at the level we need it. So there's a lot of work that's human inspired too.
Yeah, great. This is a more personal question. I was just wondering, how would you be able to describe the optimal ideas regarding few-shot learning that you mentioned during your presentation?
During the presentation, the work that Harrison did, just that EPROP algorithm and the back propagation through time could actually learn quite rapidly and update. And we played it out for that one. I showed you the first shot, but the second shot actually maybe adapted a little more and found a more optimal path. So it's continuously learning. Now, interestingly, in the brain, this was not in that model, but in the brain, one of the areas that norepinephrine region called the locus ceruleus actually has different modes. So if something is surprising, it can do a very rapid one-shot learning, has very strong projections into the hippocampus. And actually, the chemical changes from norepinephrine to dopamine, apparently. And it almost does a reset. It almost does like to that memory go, hey, let's clear out that memory because that's not valid anymore. And then try and build a new one. And I'm talking about kind of a set of experiments done with ingenious experiments done with optogenetics in mice that showed this. So that's another way the brain might actually be facilitating this few-shot learning. So neuromodulation keeps coming up. This is one thing I've noticed over the years.
Yes, great. But how do we make the system keep what was previously learned and learn both things? That's the trick, isn't it?
Yeah,
because
that is the
humans
trick.
do it.
Humans do it, and I think the work on schemas and not just our modeling work, but the work that's been done now with different organisms, including humans, I think is one clue that the prefrontal cortex is somehow monitoring and saying, hey, this is a brand new memory. I've got to create a new memory, or oh, this is something that fits with an existing memory, so I can generalize. It's still open. I'm not exactly sure how it does because it's just amazing, all the generalization. But given the combinatorics of these regions, I think it has the capacity to do this. But there are different models and arguments about the theory about how that information flows. You know, does it always flow through the hippocampus? Is it multiple streams, or is it offloading the hippocampus and just using just the cortex? And it's hard to actually get to the heart of that because most of the work depends on lesions or amnesiacs, and that's a tricky area. So it is open. I got some in my head. I've got some clues of how we do it or how it's done, but it's still just so amazing that there's got a long way to go. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you very much for amazing work and amazing presentation. I think I'll hand over to Professor Manuel Firmino Torres.
Thank you very much, Professor Jeffrey Krichmar, for your fantastic and inspiring talk, and also Professor Mansouza for moderating this event. Thank you all for participating in this 17 Creativity Talk. We look forward to see you soon at our next talk. I wish you all an excellent night and a wonderful Christmas. Please stay healthy and creative.
Very good. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.